My dear friends, this presentation is about the two mistakes I made in this case that very nearly cost me my peace of mind. The first error of judgment was I misjudged the grade of nucleus sclerosis in this case. I thought it was a chalky cataract which could be easily handled by the direct phaco-chop. And the second mistake stemmed from the first mistake, that when I was informed by the OT staff that we had no stock of pupil dilating devices, I decided to go ahead thinking that this size of pupil is enough for me to complete phaco. And for these mistakes, I ended up paying a heavy price. Let me take you through this case, which had many unexpected twists and turns. Now at the outset, due to the peribulbar block, the eye got fixed in a slightly externally rotated position and I had to pull the eye nasally every time to make it coaxial. The anterior chamber was extremely shallow. The cataract was looking white, but it looked little chalky, so I thought the nucleus sclerosis could not be very dense. The pupil was mid-dilated to around 4 millimeters, and the iris also looked very atrophic and thin under the slit lamp. So I begin the capsular rhexis, and in this case I am trying to keep the rhexis as close to the pupillary edge as possible in order to get a maximum size capsular rhexis as possible under the circumstances. This is not such an easy task because the lens was also slightly intumescent and it was quite difficult for me to control the tearing of the edge of the capsular rhexis. However, I eventually managed this. But even while performing the capsular rhexis, there was a dramatic decrease in the size of the pupil from 4 to about 3 millimeters. And while I was performing hydrodissection, I realized that this nucleus could be much harder than I thought it would be. At this point in time, I was beginning to realize that a pupil dilating device would have been a good idea in this particular case, but I still went ahead with phacoemulsification. So my parameters here are I'm using a burst mode phacoemulsification with a vacuum of 350, a duty cycle of 80% and a bottle height of 100 centimeters. So after I bury the phaco tip deep enough and after I got a pretty good hold, I initiate the crack and I'm able to go to about 90% depth, but it is at this time I realized that the nucleus is actually quite leathery. The infusion helps to dilate the pupil to a certain extent. Now it's about 4 millimeters. This is quite comfortable. And I think I can go ahead with phaco and complete it, but each and every time I perform the direct chop and I initiate the crack, I find that this nucleus is extremely leathery and I am not able to carry this crack and completely split the base plate in the center. Now in a non-dilating pupil, this is going to be a problem. As the case proceeds, the pupil also begins to get smaller. At this time, I think that the best option would be to isolate one small pie-shaped fragment and then bring it to the safe zone and emulsify it. But I find that this is not going to be possible because I have not succeeded in cracking the base plate. So I change my tactics slightly and I decide to crack this nucleus down into multiple small fragments and open it up like a flower petal. And while doing so, I'm able to see the amorphous core. So the plan is to isolate and elevate this amorphous core and eat it up. So once I do this, I will thin the center of the nucleus, and this is going to make it much more easy for me to create the separation of the fragments. Well, this was much easier said than done. The leathery nature of the cataract was completely demoralizing for me, and I found that the small pupil also added to the discomfort. The repeated direct phaco chop that I made was all only partial thickness, and even if I could split the peripheral portions, it was almost impossible for me to carry this chop through the center and split open the base plate. At this time, a little bit of iris chaffing also occurs, and I know that once this happens, this iris will keep getting sucked into the phacoprobe. So after chopping up the nucleus into multiple fragments, even though it is connected in the center, I go ahead and decapitate the petaloid fragments so that I can thin down the nucleus to its base plate. So that's what I'm trying to do. I'm just splitting this and eating up the petaloid portion of the hard nucleus, and I know that once I do this, I will be left with a flat plate which I have to take out in the center. Now you know that a hard nucleus has got so much of mass, and even though I have removed considerable portion of nucleus, I find that the progress I have made is probably only to 30 to 40% of the entire nucleus mass is out, and this is quite frustrating for me. So I come out of the eye and I consider the options. At this point, I realized that I would try to dilate the pupil by creating a small amount of pupillary stretch. Now, while creating the pupillary stretch, I use an iris repositor because I do not want to engage the edge of the capsular rhexis while executing the pupillary stretch maneuver. If the capsular rhexis tears at this point, then it's going to become more sticky. So I pass the iris repositor flush against the iris, I gently elevate it and I create a pupil stretch. This succeeds in creating a few areas of sphincter tear. However, there is no remarkable increase in the size of the pupil even after doing the stretch pupilloplasty. So with no option left to me, I continue with phacoemulsification. I have no pupil dilating devices. I was informed this before the surgery that there were no pupil dilating devices including iris hooks, but I made an error of judgment and I thought I can finish this case without them, which led me to the current predicament. So once again I try eating up each of the small petals of the split fragments cautiously. The plan is to thin down this nucleus by eating off all the periphery, the petaloid portions of the periphery to thin down, and then I wanted to flip this base plate on itself, and once the base plate is flipped, it is relatively easier to remove it. Now the pupil is getting to be quite small. I think the contact of the nucleus fragments against the pupil has stimulated the pupil to constrict further, and the pupil has become quite small to about 2 millimeters. The broken down piece of the nucleus is being slowly eaten away by phacoemulsification. Around this point, I remove the chopper and I use a ball dialer, and the plan is to use the ball dialer to elevate the base plate upwards. Let's see if the plan works. So I go underneath and I lift, and I'm able to tilt the base plate up. So now what we see is there is a phacoprobe on one side, the pupillary edge on the other side, and sandwiched between the two is the thick base plate, which acts as a buffering device preventing iris chafing. So keeping the base plate between the pupillary edge and the phacoprobe, I very carefully apply phaco energy in a very controlled fashion, and slowly I'm eating up this piece. If at any point I penetrate this thick leathery shell, then I would definitely go and chew up the iris. The entire nucleus management is unedited, and simply because I want to show you the struggle through which I had to go through because of two bad decisions I made at the beginning of the case. So now the base plate is flipped on its back, and things are becoming a little more predictable, and they tend to be coming closer or more under my control. I had switched over to the micropulse mode of phaco the minute I flipped the base plate on its side, and now the last few portions of nucleus management were done in the micropulse and not the multiburst mode. The best way to evacuate the nuclear fragment is with viscoexpression. So these small pieces are teased out from behind the iris. They are brought into the anterior chamber. And using the ball dialer, I am exploring the periphery underneath the pupil, and I find there's another small fragment which is also teased out into the anterior chamber. There are no more pieces, just some amount of cortex left. So gently using viscoelastic, I am able to tease these pieces out. And when the last fragment comes out of the eye, I definitely mentally heave a sigh of relief that the worst is over. Now what remains is removing the cortex. This has to be done very carefully because it's being done not under direct vision. In order to aid cortical aspiration, I use the ball dialer, I retract the very flaccid iris, and I'm able to spot the cortex in the periphery, which is very little, and I aspirate it. The capsular axis is intact, the posterior capsule is intact, and there's just a little bit of stray cortex in the periphery which I aspirate. So at the end of nucleus emulsification, I have successfully removed this hard cataract, but in the bargain I have created iris chaffing and a little amount of sphincter tear. I believe that this is an acceptable trade-off for removing this hard cataract. In this case, the hydrophilic acrylic intraocular lens is implanted directly inside the capsular bag. A little trick here is that when the pupil is small, only insufflate the viscoelastic in the anterior chamber. Do not put it behind the iris because this will foster an iris prolapse. So once the intraocular lens is in place, the viscoelastic is washed out from behind the lens. The lens is pivot rotated to 3 and 9 o'clock positions. The extremely flaccid iris, there is a iris chaffing at 9 o'clock and there is a small iris opening, an iridotomy at 3 o'clock. So I place a cotton bud near the side port incision to discourage the iris prolapse, and I remove the remaining portion of the viscoelastic. So this completes the end of the procedure. The wound is then secured by a combination of bud compression and injecting BSS through the side port. The eye is nice and hot, and the case is concluded with the injection of moxifloxacin within the anterior chamber.